Well, thank you. And I don't have a good sense for exactly what you may have discussed in some of these previous sessions, so forgive me if there's overlap, but Melissa asked me to think about my observations of how ecological science as a scientific discipline that actual human beings participate in, how that has evolved over the last few decades, and what my personal experiences with that have been. This is definitely from the perspective of someone who entered college interested in biology in the most general sense, came to understand that ecology was a discipline through taking a junior level ecology course, and then entered graduate school in 1977 in ecology at Cornell University. As an undergraduate, introduced to ecological science, encouraged to go into a PhD program in ecology at Cornell, which was one of the big name graduate training institutions at that time. I was introduced right away to the Ecological Society of America as a professional organization that was interested in supporting ecological research, ecological education, the training of new professional ecologists. And part of my introduction to that organization made clear that the journals they were publishing and the sort of research that was being published in the journals, very basic science, we would call it today. Very focused on basic principles and very focused on work that was being done in ecological systems that were not visibly very affected by human activity, at least as we understood it back then. We were taught that the Ecological Society was a scientific society. It had been founded way back in 1915, and that very early on, the people who were really concerned about preserving the natural areas in which ecologists did their research more or less were forced out of the society and forced to form their own organization, which was initially called the Ecologists Union. And after a couple of years, that became the Nature Conservancy, which still persists today as a real conservation organization. So right away, the whole framework was we're ecologists and we're scientists and we're here to understand basic processes, but we're not here to get involved in conservation or in preserving natural areas. That's something that activist organizations like the Nature Conservancy do, and they're different. About the time that an essay was published by a couple of well-known plant ecologists, and this essay made a number of us quite frustrated or angry. These two well-known people, academic ecologists, they published this essay basically saying that if you are a young or an early career person in ecological science, you should stay far away from any policy or conservation or environmental advocacy or even applied kinds of work. You should focus on your own career success through publishing what are called high-impact papers in these basic science journals. That is high impact from the point of view that these will be papers that other scientists will cite and that other people's graduate students will start doing projects based on the work you've done. Because that's how you will become well known as a scientist. And it's only after you're well known as a scientist, you get tenure, you become a full professor, maybe you make it into the National Academy of Sciences, then you'll be famous enough that people actually care what you say. And up till that point, who cares what you say anyway, so you're not going to have very much of an impact. And any time you spend trying to have an impact on conservation or on real world problems will just take away from the time you should be spending publishing papers and becoming famous. And this just was an outrageous essay for many of us to read, especially those of us who were never going to be in the National Academy of Sciences, because we weren't at big elite research universities, or because we chose to focus on working with students, or because we chose to focus on working on regional problems. It is people who work on regional systems who understand them the best. And there are things happening every day with the management of regional ecosystems where somebody's local specialized knowledge is very badly needed. Really, my first question for you all is whether in your childhood or in your earlier educational experiences, how did you view humans, as part of nature or as something separate from nature?
Was in my essay, and so there was a lot of freedom to go and play and explore, but also I think I grew up in somewhat of a pretty religious home, and so it was very this is for you, it was created for, and so now my ideas have definitely changed, and I view things much differently now that I've come to college and learned and experienced all these new ideas and things, and so it's all a cycle and matter and all continues.
Tendency that we ultimately ruled everything in that domain, but then as I got into undergrad and I really started, I actually don't have much of an ecology background, but I really started studying climate change and the interactions that we have, and then from that I've learned a lot about all the values we gain from nature, spiritually, culturally, and just the services that we need from nature. And definitely view it as we are ultimately connected with nature, and we rely on one another, but we also play a huge force in driving natural systems in certain states.
It wasn't really until I got to start of high school would be maybe where I started thinking that it wasn't just segregated, and then come to college was when taking ecology courses and other biology courses was when it first really hit me that it was all just connected, because growing up I grew up on a lake and I just kind of viewed all this environment and outdoorsy stuff as just a playground more than anything. Went out, camped, did your own thing, and it's as long as you didn't do anything to it, then it wasn't going to do any harm. That was kind of my mindset, and then
I grew up in Southern California, so I pretty much grew up in a city. So there was a lot of that separation of, this is nature, this is city. So, I wrote about it in my biography, or autobio, but I think that growing up it was really interesting to move here for one and be kind of in the middle of nature, and there's so much expansive wildness around us that it's really cool, and it really starts to change your perception of what nature is. And I think a lot of the courses that I've also taken, one of my favorite was the environmental philosophy, but how different societies view nature, and ultimately I've come to believe that everything's completely connected and that you can't separate the human element from nature. We are a part of nature, but it's weird how so many people grew up thinking that we're separate. Very strange.
I just wonder if people grow up today more taking for granted that level of impact, obvious impact on nature, or whether, like me, you grew up feeling like, there's still this inexhaustible reservoir out there of the oceans, the atmosphere, nature, wildlife.
I think that they are getting really loaded with messages, young kids today, younger than your generation, of messages about the environment that could be almost paralyzing to a young person. So I think that there's a balance, because in order to, get someone to want to join the team, and my daughter did my other daughter did a whole unit on plastics as her human impact challenge, and we reduced all our plastics at our house. And 2 years later, she's throwing plastic in the trash. She's just, I think that she's not yet on board. I think that she doesn't see how her small contribution can make a difference in the tidal wave. So I think that today we need to be careful that it's not painted as a tidal wave that we're kind of helpless against. We just have to adapt. That there is something that we can do to fight back.
There is some studies that actually show there's a psychological effect when you talk about things that are so scary that people just turn off. And so you can overwhelm or make them think that it's so unmanageable that it doesn't matter what you do. So that's one of the criticisms, for example, of things like invasion biology, or the idea of invasive species. The idea of creating a war with something that's invading you, in this case, it's like the war on terrorism. It can never be won. And so one of the criticisms of that is that it does orient a lot of research, and it can orient a lot of money, but then does it orient the type of action you want people to do? And so these are the kind of things that, when you think more deeply about the science you do, and Laura's story is really interesting, just to see how in one person's life, the way they conceive their object of study changes, and then the research they do changes, and then in this case the ethnic composition and the gender composition of the science changed, but ultimately that affects the research that's done, and then how that gets linked with and being reflective on that is something I don't think, at least we're several generations represented here now, you're not generally taught that in your undergraduate or graduate curriculum. It's something you kind of pick up along the way, to be reflective about the research you do and question why you do what you do, or what's the language you use, or what's your concept of what is an ecosystem and what's a legitimate question. I think that's kind of one of the things we want to get in this class. Is we talked last week about how each individual student's not actually doing sustainability science, because each individual project might just be a basic project. But really what we're trying to do is change the way you think about science per se, and be more reflective and understand how the pieces link together. Anyway, so that's my comment.
I wonder what you think of my little story about that essay about spend time building your own expertise and career, fame and fortune first, and then people will put more weight on your opinions. What do you think constitutes expertise? What does it take to be an expert?
Or study or research of a particular topic is what I would deem someone to be an expert. I don't know the time. That's hard to say. Some people learn things quickly. Some people really dive in deep, while others might just do something more or less part-time or for a few months of the year, and do it for their entire life potentially. So I don't know.
Personal experience. Other thoughts? Do credentials matter? Do publications matter? Does winning the award of being in the National Academy?
Definitely doesn't hurt. But I would say, if you looked at it from like a society perspective, it's like who backs you up, or like who has faith in like that your work is correct. Because you look at, there's scientists that came up with these theories over time that were that we found out later to be correct, but at the time they could have been experts in this field, but they were disregarded at the time because at the time it was not supported, or other people didn't back them up.
There's so many things to consider, and I guess as humans that we are able to do this because we have amazing brains, but so there's the society factor, and who do you really, and and all these different things. But I guess it really comes down to like your own personal, like, okay, I'm so sorry. We can employ different skills we can employ different skills and use certain criteria to determine if we want to believe in this thing or if we accept something as truth. And its criteria could be something like statistics, I suppose, but just simple, like you're obviously not going to get some crazy large number, like it's 1 out of 300,000 percentage, but the likelihood of something being more probable over something else type of thing. And I'm sorry. And I guess that's one point of it, but there's also, I think that's it.
Well, it's certainly, I've certainly found it a great career and life path, and it's brought me so many fantastic experiences. And yes, sometimes it's overwhelming to think of some of the challenges, but it is also inspiring to see what individual people are sometimes capable of achieving or of contributing to. So it's definitely worth the shot.